Can you imagine getting a university education without books? While that may have happened some time ago in disciplines such as computer science or mathematics, it is now settling into areas where it would have seemed impossible. The humanities, the arts, even social sciences. What's a university professor to do? And what does it say about learning in the 21st century? Let's ask. In Boston, Massachusetts, Dan Cohen, Vice Provost for Information Collaboration, Dean of Library, and Professor of History at Northeastern University. And here in our studio, Christine McWebb, Director and Professor at the Stratford School of Interaction Design and Business at the University of Waterloo. And Randy Boyagoda, Principal and Vice President of the University of St. Michael's College at U of T, also a Professor of English and the Basilian Chair in Christianity, Arts, and Letters. And we are delighted to welcome you two back to TVO. Dan Cohen, great to have you on the line from Boston, Massachusetts. And I want to start with you because you did an article in the Atlantic magazine not too long ago which advanced the following facts, which I want to share with our viewers now. At Yale, there was a 64% decline over the last decade in the number of books checked out by undergrad students. At the University of Western Virginia, the decline had reached 75%. Over a similar time period, at Canada's research libraries, the circulation of books per student declined by 84%. Start us off, Dan. What are we to infer from these numbers?
Yes, I know that they sound depressing, and I should emphasize that it's not just students. There's been a significant decline in the use of print books by faculty and by graduate students, as well as college students. I think that number from the Canadian Association of Research Libraries is pretty shocking. 15 years ago, the average college student checked out 30 books a year, and last year, that number had shrunk to just five books during a single year. So for someone like me who oversees an important research library and who is a professor of history who's written some books, it is distressing. And what I tried to point out in my article in The Atlantic is that there are a number of reasons for this decline. You can't just pin it on one element. And some of them are slightly positive, not as distressing. The distressing part is that college students do arrive on campus today having read fewer books, and that leads to fewer books checked out from the library. We just know that from the statistics, high school statistics as well.
Okay, let me do a few follow-ups with you for a second before I get the other two involved here. Do we infer from these numbers that students are reading less?
Well, that's a good question. I think that their reading habits have shifted. So I think we need to distinguish between different kinds of reading. There certainly is still reading of print books, but there's also ebooks, and our library subscribes to 1 million ebooks. So we have a huge ebook collection here at Northeastern University, and we know that the undergraduates consult those ebooks as well. They're also shifting their reading from books to articles. So as you mentioned, if we talk about the humanities versus, say, science and engineering, as we have students move from the humanities over to STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, they move into reading different kinds of materials, mostly articles. And so we've actually seen the reading of articles surge in this same time period and sort of shift away from the monograph, from the print book.
You may have a different answer to this if you were answering as a professor versus as an author, but does it matter to you whether the students read your work in a physical book as opposed to an e-reader or PDF?
To me personally, I read in both print and electronic versions, including books that my friends and colleagues have written. I think at the end of the day, and I made this point at the end of my article in The Atlantic, I'm interested in ideas. I'm a historian of ideas. I care very much about the ideas that are written down and transferred to future generations through books. But most of all, I want my students to engage with those ideas. And if they do that through an electronic book or through an article, that's great. Having said that, I still think that print books are important. There are certain kinds of immersive reading that I completely believe, as I do myself, work better in print. But there are many cases in which you need to just look up a quick reference or just read a single chapter, and downloading an ebook is perfectly fine with me in those cases.
Okay, one more before we get the other two in here. You've described the library spaces at universities as increasingly dormant, but also library spaces themselves remain vibrant. That sounds like a conundrum, so explain that to us.
Actually, they're less dormant than different kinds of activities are going on in them. Actually, here at Northeastern, we had 2.3 million visits to our Snell Library here on campus in Boston. That is a record, actually, for our library. It means more students are actually coming to the library. Are they pulling books off the shelf? Well, that has been in decline for years now. But they are using the spaces in new ways. So we have new digital spaces where they might be engaging in projects relating to digital media and technology. There are group collaboration spaces. We have an increasing number of classes that instead of assigning an end of semester essay, they might assign a group project to tackle big issues like climate change or income inequality that will involve 8 to 10 students working in a group. And so they book or use spaces that are more engaging and collaborative in the library. But we still also have carols. There are still focus study spaces. I still think students value the space of the library. That's certainly been our experience here at Northeastern. It's a valuable space for them to get away from other things and to focus on what they want to learn, what they want to create. The kinds of projects they do are shifting, and again, I think they're shifting perhaps away maybe from longer text projects to multimedia kinds of projects, but they still do value the library. And so actually in our library, it's not dormant at all. I just came over from the library, and it is as busy as ever. There are thousands of students there right now.
Okay, thank you for setting the table for the discussion to come. I want to know from you, Christine, how difficult it is to get your undergraduate students to pick up, read, and finish a book.
I do have to say that there has been quite a shift over the last years. So, for example, I have reduced the number of readings that I would typically assign now in comparison to, let's say, 10 years ago.
When you say readings, you mean books?
No, so in
just reading at all.
I mean articles. So the number of articles. When I teach at the Stratford School, it's mostly article based. What I have noticed is that the students will go to these articles electronically. That's a given. So they do not go and look at journals and photocopy the way we used to, and that's okay. Obviously, they don't need to do that anymore. What I find is they have a hard time sticking to the reading. So they might read in a very kind of a cursory fashion. They typically, or not typically, but they often have difficulty finishing the article.
The attention span just isn't there.
The attention isn't there. So I've actually done a few exercises where I've tried to increase the attention span and get them to read. And so I use apps where there are chat facilities, chat features that are incorporated into the app. And so the students, they comment, they discuss the article online, for example.
So this works?
4 marks.
This works to get them to hang in there?
At first I thought it worked, and then I noticed that they figured out very quickly. If my students watch this, I don't know what they're going to think, but I figured out very quickly that they read the first 3 to 5 pages, and they make comments on the first 3 to 5 pages, and then after that it's a big plank.
The ingenuity of students to avoid doing work hasn't changed in decades.
No.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, yeah. Randy, you, how about your first-year students? How would you gauge the level of their reading skills?
I think the fact that I teach a physical book to start off in the first-year class that I teach at St. Mike's at U of T is frankly a way that comes out of an experience with just what I'll call flat skim reading, if it's too digital. We concentrate the attention when we have a physical book in our hands because the book doesn't take you anywhere else except in here, right? So I have found in a really striking way that students respond to the physical object of the book. They take it more seriously. They're more attentive to it than I think if it's on a screen. Part of it is distraction. Part of it, I think, is just you don't have the same physical relationship to the experience. Now, in this class, I teach lots of stuff, lots of articles, essays, excerpts that are all available online. But even as somebody lecturing, I can't lecture from a screen. I have to print out everything and make notes. And I really encourage the students as much as possible to do the same. Whether they do or not is another matter.
So there's still a legitimacy to the hard copy book.
They treat it differently. It's a much bigger deal for them to get the book than to get a screen version of it.
Having said that, Do they read? Do students today like to read?
Yes, if they'll pick it up and read, absolutely they will. But I think part of it is our own modeling, frankly, as faculty, as lecturers, what it means to take these books seriously. If they see us, frankly, playing with our phones the second the lecture is finished, or fetishizing some third-party technology over and against reading the actual book, well, then we're sending them a pretty strong signal, I think.
Yep.
But I think they are hungry for it. You know, I think if you ask them about their own sort of personal reading habits and where they note kind of depth and quality as opposed to, you know, kind of a surface level kind of consumption, more often than not, they're going to point to physical books, I'm going to guess, over and against the digital.
Dan, in your view, well, you say this in the Atlantic piece, the time to acquire the reading bug is much earlier than freshman year of university. So who should be responsible for making sure that young people have a love of learning, a love of reading, engaged with text before first year?
Well, I think this is a great opportunity for colleges and universities to partner with primary and secondary schools to really inculcate the love of reading. I mean, I do think that the time to pick up the habit is, 12 years, 10 years, 8 years before you get to college. And I do think that, Randy's point about modeling of parents who read and show their kids that they're, not just reading for work or to get through something for a course, but are actually enjoying the process and are sort of, wading into a fun novel. That's really important. And I do, as I pointed out in the Atlantic piece, it does concern me that we sort of reached peak book, the sort of apex of the number of circulations, at least recently, the year before the iPhone came out, and that we've now undergone this sort of uncontrolled experiment where we have this black rectangle in our pocket all the time, available to us to sort of pull out for moments, to occupy those moments, rather than maybe a paperback book, or some other article, physical piece of reading. So, I think that programs, we run one here at Northeastern called First Book, where there's a sort of fall program that encourages, everyone on campus to read a book, the same book, and to sort of talk about that, and to have events that really emphasize the importance of books. Not just for knowledge, but for fun. I think that is really critical. In my library, we have a nice display when students walk in the library that are just fun books that they could take home for the weekend. Our librarians do a great job curating those books and sort of providing an alternative to say, here's a wide range, whether it's graphic novels or young adult lit, or some more recent novels that are in the news, or nonfiction. We at least try to display those in attractive ways to entice students. But again, I think that that's perhaps a little too late, and I think that we need to think about longer range programs to retain the love of reading in the age of the iPhone and all these devices that we have in our pockets.
Randy wants a follow-up on what you've said.
Just to Dan, here's a live on-air confession. I'm speaking now as an English professor, a lifelong reader, and novelist. 2 summers ago, I realized I could not read a novel for more than maybe 5 minutes without checking my news app on my iPhone.
Et tu, Brute?
Si. and I gave up my iPhone as a result. I dropped it. I only have a dumb phone now. But what I decided to do 2 summers ago was only read a novel. I picked Infinite Jest, a 1,000-page postmodern epic. And I read every single word of it as a kind of practice to return, to kind of strengthen those reading muscles again. And then I have 4 daughters. My wife has a PhD in English. We are a family of readers. But what really matters is my wife and I modeling for them reading physical books and getting away. It doesn't surprise me, Dan's point about the iPhone decline, getting away from that kind of permanent temptation. And also, and here's the thing for adults, the kind of self-righteousness of it. No, I need to be checking the news because I need to be really on top of the latest thing going on in Washington right now. That's vanity.
Yeah.
You're really just finding an excuse to not read because reading is harder before it becomes more pleasurable.
Easier to be distracted, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Christine, let me I'll play devil's advocate here.
Yeah, okay.
What's the problem with acquiring academic knowledge through YouTube videos, PDFs, the digital world, as opposed to reading an entire physical, actual book?
Okay, so I would say it depends on the kind of academic knowledge that you are acquiring. So I think it was Marian Wolf who used the term of bilateral reading, which I actually find, she proposes this as a solution to this conundrum of can we get our students to read? And what she is suggesting is that we should make the difference between kind of superficial reading, where it's just looking for facts, you just want to have a quick understanding of something. And then I think YouTube is just fine. And I mean, this is our go-to, not just for students, but I mean, for us too, right? Or Wikipedia, or something where we can get quick factual knowledge. However, if we do want our students to get what we would now call a deep dive analysis, right? So something, a reading with which they really have to engage, where they have to get into it. They have to, as you said, read every word and critically think about the text. Then I would argue that sources such as YouTube or Wikipedia or just a quick Google based on keyword search is not enough. So we do have to make that distinction.
Do you ever say to your students, apropos of Randy's example, it's really important that you pick up an actual book and read it from beginning to end, because if you don't use it, you'll lose it, meaning those skills of actually reading a book?
Yeah, so yes, we actually have those conversations because it's part of my course. I also teach media history. So we talk about other times in history, such as the switch, the transition from handwritten manuscripts to the printing press, for example. And what happened then? I mean, that was a major switch in terms of how knowledge is distributed and how bits of knowledge are connected with each other and how you absorb knowledge. So we do have that conversation, and it's quite astonishing what the students say. So I have a lot of students who will say that when they read for pleasure, they prefer the physical book. And when they read for their studies, they are okay reading on an e-reader or just downloading an article or just looking it up online.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Dan, can everybody be expected to read well?
Well, you know, look, it is an acquired skill, and it's one of the most amazing things that we humans do. I mean, reading and writing is an incredible process, a very complicated one, and it takes practice. I think the idea of not just modeling, but showing students how you can, for instance, annotate and underline and really engage sort of physically with the book, or frankly with a PDF. Just the idea of deep reading it's an acquired skill. And I think that everyone can do it, but it takes practice. And I think we should be open to multiple ways of doing that. I think different students learn how to read well in, again, different ways, or sort of different approaches to that. But you know, the first thing that we need to get across is also the pleasure of it. I mean, I think that the phone has diverted some of that pleasure. It's perhaps a cheaper pleasure related to, you know, dopamine and those sorts of things. But I think a good novel is incredibly pleasurable. And if we can get that across, if we can get the point across that reading isn't just a hard slog that you sort of have to figure out how to do, but that a lot of times when you get 20 pages into a book, the hours pass by and you end up at the back cover. That's really important to get across. And so I think we should think more about how to get students to sort of engage in that process and realize for themselves that it can be quite pleasurable.
Randy, I want to be completely crassly commercial about this. I wonder if you ever say to your students something like, have you ever heard of Warren Buffett? Well, Warren Buffett is a multi-billionaire many times over, and his advice is read 500 pages a day. That's how knowledge works. It builds up like compound interest. If they knew that that was the advice they were getting from a guy like that, would it make a difference?
It might for a few of them. I think that what you're speaking to really is a piece in a recent New York Times Sunday Review about charting the graph for humanities majors versus STEM majors and their earning potential. You know, if you want to make money, study poetry. There's lots of arguments for all of the goods of a humanities education with reading as a deep practice at the core of it. I think sort of yes to all of that, but really, if I kind of connect the Buffett idea with what Dan was just saying, our students are open, I think, to being convinced that pleasure reading and the pleasure that comes from a deep engagement of a book in a university context don't have to be completely separate things, but that integration of the pleasure of reading with the pleasure of discovering ideas, arguing about ideas, responding to a writer, seeing marginalia. I mean, think about that experience when you're in a university library and you see someone, vehemently underline something in a library book and disagree with it, and then you're joining a conversation there, right? Students should understand there is a deep and good and lasting pleasure with significant professional consequences, Pache Warren Buffett, to reading physical books. And I think that's really what we all have to really make more of a case for. And I think they're open to it. That's my point. I think they're open to it.
Well, I want to, let me follow up with Christine on this. How difficult is it for you to convince a student about the pleasures of reading a physical book if they do not come from a family or from a background where that has been part of their lives?
I think it's very difficult to tell you the truth. What I'm hearing here is that, reading at the end of the day is also, it's a habit, right? So, maybe we are a little bit unfair to our students as well, because, this generation has not grown up necessarily with the practice of reading physical books. So, it's just not in their practice. And for a lot of them. Obviously you can never generalize, but I think for a lot of them, it's just not in their habits, it's not part of their daily lives. So when they come to university and in a literature course, for example, we ask them to read 5 novels, then understandably they might have a problem with that.
So they don't do it.
They don't do it, or they get summaries. They look it up online and just look for keywords, of the topics that they might have to
Mind you,
know about.
I can't sit here and be holier than thou. I know back in the day we used to just get the
We did
Cole's
the
notes,
same,
right?
exactly.
They called it Cole's notes.
That's right. So that was my next point. We too. I'm going to be completely honest about this. My reading habits have changed a lot. So I used to read just like you were saying. I still read all the time. I read novels for pleasure and, of course, also for work. And I write books as well. And so I'm always surrounded by words and I'm always reading. But I find myself, when I typically read on an e-reader, and I switch. If there's something that I want to look up, I look it up. If I quickly want to see, oh yeah, I wanted to check this on Instagram, I check it on Instagram. And so our habits as professors, I think, are also changing. And the way I do research is very different now than it used to be. So, we are kind of going along the same shift.
Aren't we, though?
With the students. Yeah.
Dan, I want to put a quote to you from Neil Postman, the late media critic, who said books were, quote, the model, the metaphor, and the measure of all discourse. And I wonder whether you think they are still that.
Well, I still think books today are still the highest density concentration of thought and human expression that we have. They are an amazing repository for just an infinite variety of stories and thinking and conversation and debate. And as such, I do think that they are at the sort of apex of what we have done. But I also think that there are new forms of knowledge that are both narrative and textual, but also relate to the 21st century. We now have data and all kinds of visualizations and graphical means of expressing ourselves and getting across different kinds of studies and scholarship and work. And so, I would advocate for expanding the palette. We still must treasure books in all of their forms, in print, in electronic format, and in audiobooks, which is, I think, a fine way for some students to engage with something like a novel. But also we'll have new forms that are heterogeneous, that are partly online, that involve new media. But we need to maintain that depth of thought all along. We can't just go down into a sort of superficial realm of the black rectangle with brightly lit photos. I think we need to reserve a spot for ourselves, for humanity, to be able to pass to each other important narratives, important ideas for now and for the future.
Randy, can I ask you about your kids? Mm-hmm. You mentioned you had 4 girls. Mm-hmm. They come from a home where clearly mom and dad are very educated and love reading and probably read in front of them lots.
Sure.
Did you have to do anything particular to get them to love books?
No, I think, and this very much speaks to Christine's point, I think it was very natural in our household. I mean, the most significant room in our house is our library. And I think you would see often enough just random child 1, 2, or 3, or 4 in there reading. Our problem is just sometimes getting them to stop reading, which is a wonderful problem to have.
So unprompted, they will just pick up a book?
Constantly, absolutely. That's the case. And the challenge becomes, how do you extend that when you don't have that as the kind of the natural context? I'm thinking about something like the Children's Book Bank here in Toronto, where publishers provide directly copies of finished books for children who might not have that same natural context to pick up a book and really enjoy it.
I have heard parents, in order to inculcate a love of reading in their children, will, for example, pay them $20 every time they finish a book, and they write up a little précis of what the book was about. What do you think of that idea?
I would be bankrupt within a week in that situation.
You don't need to do it because your kids are obviously self-starters on this, but as an idea to get children to love reading an actual book, what do you think?
No, I think the book will be the answer. If you can get past those first 10, 15 pages, then the problem becomes getting them out of the book, if it works, right? But again, it has to do with modeling, it has to do with making it a good and positive thing, right? I asked my kids this morning before coming in for this show whether they'd rather read a book they really liked on an iPad, and they love iPads. Anytime you give them an iPad or a book, and they all said the book. And I said, why? And they said, because my eyes hurt with the iPad, and then I want to do other things. I want to play other things.
Yeah, they're aware of it.
Right? They're aware of it, exactly, which is why, something like St. Augustine's Confessions, the book I'm teaching in the Gilson Seminar at St. Mike's right now, they want the physical copy of it, right? There's no distraction except the beauty of the book itself.
Do you worry, Christine, that the days of picking up an actual book, never mind to read anything that's out there now, but William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Tolstoy, are we just not going to do this anymore in 25 years?
Yeah, I have to say I am a little pessimistic about that. Yes, I am worried about that.
Does that bother you?
Yes, because I mean it's such a treasure that's being lost. I mean when you actually, like you said, when you get into those books, and I think maybe sometimes students just have to allow themselves the patience and not getting the instant gratification after 5 seconds, and just wait a little bit, and then they will enjoy it. So that does bother me, because there's such a treasure trove of cultural knowledge, of just beautiful writing out there, that a lot of people just won't know that it's there anymore. So yes, I am a little nostalgic.
Yeah. Dan, I've got a minute left here. Let me give it to you. It's easy for us to come off as a bunch of fuddy-duddies here, given how things are changing. And I wonder whether you think we ought to be. Is the old way of doing things important enough to try to pass on to the next generation, or should we just throw in the towel and say, why not? PDFs, e-readers, knock yourself out.
Well, I could be wrong about the psychology of college students, but I think pushing something on them is not the way to go, or to say the old ways are better than your generation's ways. That's not a great approach. I think, just to sum up, I think our conversation, I think we need to show students that these are not old ways. These are ways that throughout time, past, present, and future, we have a chance to really express ourselves and to put that into paper or electronic format, into narratives that will be exciting, that will be interesting, and that will let us be human and express our views to each other. So I think there's a great future for books, but we have to be the stewards of this incredible, what is at the end of the day, a technology of the codex of the book.
A nice place to leave it. I want to thank all three of you for coming on to TVO tonight. Dan Cohen from Northeastern University, or as they pronounce it down there, Northeastern University. Christine McWebb, University of Waterloo. Randy Boyagoda from the University of St. Michael's College at U of T. Great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.